Imagine standing in a crowd watching the most dangerous challenge ever made. On one side stands Elijah, just one man. No army, no weapons, no followers standing beside him. On the other side stand 450 prophets of Baal, hundreds of priests, hundreds of voices, hundreds of people who claim their God controls the sky, the storms, and the fire. And the entire nation of Israel is watching. For years the people had turned away from the true God. They followed the king, they followed false prophets, and they believed that Baal was the one who sent rain and controlled the heavens. But Elijah had a different message. He stepped forward and shouted to the people, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." The crowd said nothing. So Elijah proposed something shocking. A test. 2 altars would be built on the top of Mount Carmel. 1 altar for Baal, 1 altar for the Lord. Each side would place a sacrifice on the wood, but no one would light the fire. Instead, they would call on their God. And the God who answered with fire from heaven would be proven to be the real God. The crowd gasped, because this was not just a religious debate anymore. This was a public showdown. Hundreds of prophets against one lonely man. And if Elijah failed, he would almost certainly die. But Elijah did not step back. He stood calmly before the entire nation and said something that would change history forever. The God who answers by fire, he is God. And soon, the sky itself would respond. Fire. Before the great confrontation on Mount Carmel, the nation of Israel had already drifted far from the God who had rescued them from Egypt. Years earlier, a powerful king ruled the land, Ahab. He was strong, ambitious, and determined to expand his kingdom. But the most dangerous decision he ever made was not political. It was spiritual. King Ahab married Jezebel, a princess from a foreign nation. She was devoted to the worship of Baal, a false god believed to control storms, lightning, and rain. When Jezebel came to Israel, she did not come quietly. She brought her religion with her. Soon temples to Baal appeared across the land. Altars were built. Priests were appointed. Public worship of Baal became common in cities and villages. And slowly, the people began to forget the God who had once led them through the wilderness. Under Jezebel's influence, something even darker began to happen. Prophets who still spoke in the name of the Lord were hunted down. Many were forced to hide in caves. Some were captured and killed. Fear spread across the land. Instead of standing for truth, most people chose silence. They watched as the worship of Baal grew stronger. They watched as the king supported it. And they said nothing. Then something strange happened. The rain stopped. At first, people thought it was temporary. But weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The rivers shrank. Fields dried up. Crops failed. Animals began to die. The entire nation slowly realized they were living in a terrible drought. But this drought was not an accident. Years earlier, one man had walked into the palace of King Ahab and made a shocking announcement. That man was Elijah. Standing boldly before the king, Elijah had said, "As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, there will be no rain or dew in the next few years except at my word." And from that moment forward, the sky above Israel became silent. No rain, no storms, just dry wind and empty clouds. The god Baal was supposed to control the weather. His prophets claimed he ruled the sky. But now the heavens refused to respond. And as the drought continued year after year, one question began to grow in the hearts of the people. What if Baal wasn't real at all? What if the God Elijah served was the only true God? Eventually, after 3 long years of drought, the time finally came for that question to be answered. And it would be answered publicly, before the king, before hundreds of prophets, before the entire nation, on the top of Mount Carmel. A day was coming when heaven itself would respond with fire. Fire. After 3 long years without rain, the land of Israel had become dry and desperate. Rivers were nearly empty. Crops had failed. Even the animals were struggling to survive. During that time, Elijah had been hiding far from the king's reach. Because ever since the drought began, Ahab had been searching everywhere for the prophet who dared to declare that the rain would stop. To the king, Elijah was the one responsible for the nation's suffering. But now the time had come for Elijah to return. God told him to go back and face the king. So Elijah walked openly into the land again, no longer hiding. Eventually, he met one of the king's officials and sent a message directly to Ahab. "Tell your master, Elijah is here. When Ahab finally saw him again, the king was furious. "Is that you?" Ahab shouted. "You troubler of Israel?" But Elijah did not step back. "I have not made trouble for Israel," he replied calmly. "You and your father's family have abandoned the commands of the Lord and followed Baal." Then Elijah made a bold demand. "Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal who eat at Jezebel's table." The king agreed. Soon the entire nation gathered on the mountain. Hundreds of prophets stood proudly together, dressed in their ceremonial robes. Behind them stood the power of the royal palace, and standing across from them was just one man. Elijah stepped forward and looked at the people of Israel. His voice echoed across the mountain. "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." The people remained silent. So Elijah announced the challenge that would decide everything. "Bring 2 bulls. Let Baal's prophets choose one and prepare it. I will prepare the other, but no one will light the fire." The crowd leaned closer. "Then you call on the name of your God," Elijah continued, "and I will call on the name of the Lord." He paused for a moment, letting the silence build. "The God who answers by fire. He is God." This was no small contest. 450 prophets against one man. If Baal answered, Elijah would be proven wrong. But if Baal stayed silent, the entire nation would witness the truth. The people finally spoke. "What you say is good." The test was about to begin. Fire. The crowd gathered tightly on the slopes of Mount Carmel. Thousands of people had come to watch what would happen. Farmers, families, soldiers, and leaders stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting to see which God would answer. In the center of the mountain clearing stood the 450 prophets of Baal. Across from them stood only one man, Elijah. Elijah gestured toward the prophets and said calmly, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you." The prophets quickly began their ritual. They placed the bull on the altar and arranged the wood carefully underneath it. The sacrifice was ready. Now all that remained was for their God to send the fire. The prophets lifted their hands toward the sky and began to shout, "Baal, answer us." Their voices echoed across the mountain. Again they cried out, "Baal, hear us. Send the fire." The crowd watched closely. Surely Baal, the god who was supposed to control storms and lightning, would respond. But the sky remained silent. Still, the prophets continued. Hour after hour they called out. They danced wildly around the altar, performing their rituals with increasing desperation. "Baal, answer us." But nothing happened. No fire, no thunder, no lightning, just the quiet wind moving across the mountain. By midday the scene had become almost unbelievable. Hundreds of prophets were shouting, dancing, and pleading with their God. And still the heavens were silent. That's when Elijah did something unexpected. He began to mock them. "Shout louder," he called out to them. "Surely he is a god. Maybe he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling somewhere." The crowd murmured as they listened. Elijah continued with a hint of humor in his voice. "Perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened." The prophets became even more frantic. They shouted louder than before, screaming toward the sky. According to their custom, they even began cutting themselves with knives and spears as part of their ritual, hoping to force their god to respond. Blood flowed as they continued their desperate cries. "Baal, answer us." But the sky did not move. No fire came. No voice answered. The sun slowly began to move across the sky as afternoon approached. The once powerful prophets now looked exhausted. Their voices were weak. Their rituals had failed. And the entire nation of Israel had just witnessed something shocking. 450 prophets had cried out all day long. But Baal had never answered. Not once. Then Elijah stepped forward. And the real miracle was about to begin. Fire. By the time the prophets of Baal collapsed from exhaustion, the entire crowd on Mount Carmel had fallen into a tense silence. All day they had watched the prophets shout, dance, and beg their God to answer. But nothing had happened. No fire, no voice, no sign that Baal was even listening. The sun had begun to drift toward the afternoon sky when Elijah finally stepped forward. "Come here to me," he said calmly. The people slowly gathered closer around him. In front of them stood an old altar of the Lord that had long been broken and forgotten. Stones had fallen apart. The place where people once worshipped the true God had been abandoned. Elijah knelt down beside it. One by one, he began picking up the stones. 12 stones. Not 11. Not 10. 12. Each stone represented one of the tribes of Israel, a reminder that the nation once belonged to the God who had brought them out of Egypt. Carefully, Elijah rebuilt the altar stone by stone while the crowd watched in silence. When the altar was finished, he arranged the wood on top of it. Then he cut the bull into pieces and placed the sacrifice on the wood. But Elijah wasn't finished yet. He did something that made the crowd whisper in confusion. "Fill 4 large jars with water," he said, "and pour it on the offering and on the wood." The servants obeyed. Water soaked the sacrifice. The wood became wet. Then Elijah said something even more shocking. "Do it again." They poured another 4 jars of water. The altar became completely soaked. Still Elijah wasn't satisfied. "Do it a 3rd time." Another 4 jars of water were poured out. Now water was running down the altar and filling the trench Elijah had dug around it. The sacrifice was completely drenched. The wood was dripping wet. If fire were going to appear, this would be the worst possible conditions. The crowd stared in disbelief. Why would Elijah make it harder for the fire to burn? But Elijah stood calmly beside the altar. He raised his eyes toward heaven. The moment everyone had been waiting for had finally come. And unlike the prophets of Baal who had shouted all day, Elijah would pray only once. And what happened next would change the faith of an entire nation forever. Fire. The crowd stood completely still on Mount Carmel. The altar was ready. The sacrifice was soaked with water. 12 large jars had already been poured over it. The wood was dripping wet. Water filled the trench around the altar and ran down the stones. From a human perspective, it was impossible for this altar to catch fire. But Elijah had designed it this way on purpose. Everyone needed to know that if fire appeared, it could only come from one place. Heaven. Elijah stepped closer to the altar. The entire nation watched him. Hundreds of prophets of Baal sat nearby, exhausted and defeated after their desperate rituals. Their God had never answered them. Now it was Elijah's turn. But unlike the prophets who had shouted for hours, Elijah simply bowed his head and prayed. His voice was calm. "Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant." The crowd listened carefully. Elijah continued, "Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." The prayer was short. No screaming, no dancing, no ritual, just a quiet request. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind moved across the mountain. The people held their breath. Then suddenly, fire exploded from the sky. A blazing column of heavenly fire crashed down onto the altar. The flames instantly consumed the sacrifice. The wood burned in a flash. The stones themselves cracked and crumbled under the heat. The water in the trench vanished in a burst of steam. Within seconds, the entire altar was gone, completely consumed by the fire of God. The crowd gasped in shock. Some people fell to their knees immediately. Others covered their faces in fear. There was no doubt now, no debate, no confusion. The God of Elijah had answered, and he had answered with fire. Fire. For a moment after the fire fell, the entire mountain was silent. Smoke still rose from the place where the altar had stood. The stones were shattered. The sacrifice was completely gone. Even the water that had filled the trench had vanished. Everyone on Mount Carmel had just witnessed something impossible. No human could have created that fire. No trick could explain what they had seen. The people looked at the destroyed altar, then at the man standing beside it, Elijah. And suddenly the crowd began to fall to their knees. Voices rose across the mountain as thousands of people cried out the same words together. "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." For years they had followed lies. For years they had trusted false prophets. For years they had believed that Baal controlled the rain and the sky. But now they had seen the truth with their own eyes. The God of Israel was alive, and He had answered. Elijah immediately took action. The false prophets who had led the nation into deception were captured and removed, so they could no longer mislead the people. The land that had been drowning in spiritual darkness was finally turning back toward the truth. But something else still needed to happen. The drought was not over yet. For 3 long years the sky had remained closed above Israel. So Elijah climbed to the top of the mountain again. He bowed low to the ground and began to pray. Once, then again, and again. He sent his servant to look toward the sea. "Do you see anything?" Elijah asked. Nothing, the servant replied. 6 times the answer was the same. But the 7th time, the servant returned with different news. I see a small cloud about the size of a man's hand. Elijah smiled, because he knew what it meant. Soon the wind began to rise. Dark clouds filled the sky. Thunder rolled across the hills of Israel. And then, for the first time in 3 years, rain began to fall. The drought was over. But the greatest miracle that day was not the fire. It was the hearts of the people finally turning back to the God who had never abandoned them. And the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel would forever remind the world of one powerful truth. The real God does not stay silent forever. When the moment is right, he answers. Fire.